Member for Roe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I firstly acknowledge Kirsty Pratt and her husband in the gallery, and can I compliment Kirsty on her perseverance and her the way she turns up here every day. I'm sure the government are well aware of it, but she's a fantastic advocate for the victims of sexual abuse, and I'm certainly proud of her effort in turning up here each day to represent all of those people, and it was also a pleasure to meet her husband this morning. And I guess for me, as the member for Roe, this is a very important issue. Mainly because of two things, I guess. One being that, I'm a community member of Katanning. I was at the Katanning High School from the years 1975 through to 77, and as it's turned out, that was probably the worst period of which Dennis McKenna and the activities at St Andrew's Hostel were happening. So obviously at that age, sort of 14, 15 years old, I was oblivious to this, but I had many friends who attended the hostel, and now as time's gone on, I've seen the results of the abuse, the damage that it's done to many of those victims, the effect that it's had on their lives and their families as years have gone by, in the form of suicides, of family breakdown, marital breakdown, and so forth. So this subject is very close to my heart. It also is in respect to my constituents, not only in the Katanning area, but also in the Esperance area, and as has been spoken about here today, the member for Ayr, the previous member, Dr Graham Jacobs, who did move the private members bill in late 2016, and Graham was my opponent at the state election, but I certainly compliment him for his efforts on advocating for the victims of child sex abuse. And the likes of the Beale family as well, who I've been in constant contact with from Esperance, and I really applaud their efforts, and the many other families in the Esperance Conding Up region who've been affected by this matter. And I guess for me, in some ways, I sort of feel a sense of shame. Obviously, I wasn't here in Parliament last year when the debate was going on that the member for Scarborough referred to, and how it was, deteriorated into a pretty mediocre debate, which I think we need to move on from that space. I'm certainly looking forward to some movement from the Attorney General. He provided a list of excuses that have been wheeled out over the last few weeks, along with the Premier. And we'll sort of go into those shortly. But personally, I intend to keep the pressure on. I agree with the member for South Perth that there's absolutely no reason why this legislation cannot be introduced this year, as per the Attorney General and the Premier's promise of late last year and early this year, prior to the election campaign. And certainly on behalf of Kirsty and the other members sitting in the gallery tonight, and for the weeks and months past, I met some other child sex abuse victims in the southern entrance to Parliament the other week, and it was great to catch up with them. And I know the Attorney General has also been communicating with them and keeping them in the picture. So I guess for me, the introduction of this legislation, the results will be immeasurable, and I think it'll bring hope into their lives. And I think that living without hope renders a person helpless, and they feel like they've got a lack of control over their life. And I think if we can get this legislation through, I think it will make a great difference to many of those victims. And I would like to quote Mr. Todd Jeffress from an ABC News article on the 26th of October 2017. And he said, "It would mean I could say, this is the end, and move on with my life." And Mr. Jeffress was one of the victims at Katanning at the St Andrews Hostel. And he said that the ongoing psychological damage had been massive and had caused him to doubt himself, to be reckless and to do stupid things. And I think it's for people like Mr. Jeffress that the Attorney-General has let down up until now, but I'm hoping that he can reinstate himself in the weeks ahead. And I think enabling a wronged and powerless person access to a process for redress is a very small thing that the government can do for the survivors. And it's an action that this government has promised it would do for the survivors within the first days of its administration. And I think that would make a great difference to the lives of those survivors. And I would like to move on just to add to my comments about the member for Eyre of the time, Graham Jacobs. I've caught up with Graham several times recently. He's back on the stethoscope there at the Banksia Medical Practice in Esperance, and doing a great job there. And I've had the opportunity to talk to him briefly about this issue, and I certainly, as I said, congratulate him for his advocacy on behalf of the victims. I would like to go into a couple of quotes, if I can, Mr. Acting Speaker, from members of the now government, and if I can, further to what the member for South Perth, quoting the member for Midland and now Minister for Police, when she criticised the Barnett government for its delay tactics surrounding the Jacobs Private Members Bill. And I quote, "One that needs to be dealt with as a matter of priority and in a timely fashion. This is a most serious matter and the opposition will not let go of it. We want to see this bill pass this year. We do not think that it is acceptable that it wait another year." That was 20th of October 2016, and now we've got the government that's been there for 8 months and nothing's happened. So I refer to, since 2014, the WA Labor Party has had a policy statement that says WA Labor would allow exemptions under the Statute of Limitations to allow child sexual abuse victims to sue for damages for crimes committed many years ago. WA Labor would also allow class actions to be taken in Western Australia. So the policies are there, the statements from their members are there, and I refer back to, I'd like to repeat one that I think the member for Scarborough and the leader of the opposition brought out. On the day that the Attorney-General was sworn in, he said his first priority was to lift the statute of limitations for victims of child sex abuse, seeking compensation, and introduce no body, no parole laws for convicted murderers. So the Attorney-General made it very clear in his first statement, straight after he was sworn in, that this was his first priority. And here we are in November. I also refer to my question of the 12th of October, where I asked the Premier where was the legislation, what was going on. And the Premier's reply was there's a few complexities that they're working through, including the Commonwealth Redress Scheme and how to ensure organisations were accountable. And as our member for Central Wheatbelt said at the time, you don't think there were any of those complexities last year. And I think this really explains it, that the delaying tactics that are going on here, using the Commonwealth legislation as an opportunity to delay this process. And when you look at the Commonwealth legislation, you've got Victoria and New South Wales who've already jumped on board with their legislation, and you've got Queensland and Western Australia who are hopefully very soon going to join the ranks. And unfortunately, my understanding of the Commonwealth legislation is that not only do you have to actually wait for all of those institutions, churches, religious organisations, etc., to jump on board and be part of that package. So as far as I'm concerned, the chances of that happening are very slim. So we need to deal with this as a state parliament. And I'd just like to quote our now Premier in the lead up to the state election, not at this stage, thanks member, in the lead up to the state election in 2017, where the now Premier said, "Every day there is a delay, there is justice denied." And I think that sums it up very well. And the other thing that I would like to bring up is what the member for Scarborough spoke about with I believe tomorrow is the 43rd piece of legislation which will be introduced by the government since they've come into power. And I find it extraordinary that we haven't been able to find room on the agenda for the Attorney-General and the Premier's most important priority leading up to the state election. And if I can list just a few of the bills. The first Homeowners Grant Bill 2017, the Local Government Amendment Auditing Bill 2017, the Constitution Amendment Demise of the Crown Bill 2017, and honestly, there's three bills that the Attorney-General has carriage of himself. Court Jurisdiction Legislation Amendment Bill 2017, Courts Legislation Amendment Bill 2017 and the Coroner's Amendment Bill 2017, Mr Speaker. Flowing on from that, you've got the Port Kennedy Development Bill 2017, and the one that really gets me is the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill. So no one can tell me that any of those bills are more important than this bill that we are talking about here today.
Can I just ask one question? Is it more important than genetically modified crops to access to?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it is. As far as I'm concerned, it is. That's right. We're talking about. Well, I'm talking about what is my priority as the member for Roe, and the priority for those victims, of which Kirsty is one up here in the gallery. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the number one priority. And I agree with the Premier and the Attorney-General when they said that this was their first priority coming into government. One of the other things I'd just like to mention, obviously the Royal Commission, which has been mentioned here today, and I speak at times to Andrew Murray, one of the Royal Commissioners, who was, I was fortunate to be a member of the WA Regional Development Trust that Andrew chaired, and I really admire the Royal Commissioners, the work that they've done, the difficulties, and it's ongoing, of course, and it's been going for many years. So, but what the Royal Commission has done is laid the pathway for the state government to progress legislation for redress for the victims. And as I said, Victoria and New South Wales have already done it, and this is our opportunity as a state to go forth and continue on. So, in summary, we've got a Premier who promised, Kirsty Pratt in the gallery, and the Beale family and the many other victims from Katanning, St Andrews Hostel and elsewhere, that this would be the first legislation he would introduce. We've got an Attorney-General that said this is his highest priority, and has yet presided over 30 pieces of legislation, 3 of which he has got carriage of, and we've got nowhere there. We've had a cabinet committee of which the member for Scarborough and member for Central Wheatbelt were members of, and they paved the way for that legislation after the debates of late last year and the motion that Dr. Graham Jacobs moved. So, as I said, I'm sure there's bipartisan support. I'm sure I agree with the member for South Perth who expressed support for it. I certainly support the legislation. So I'd certainly ask the Attorney-General to get on with it, bring the legislation on, because I want to go back to the victims, I want to go back to my constituents and tell them that the Parliament of WA has done its job. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.